Good evening, all. It's really a pleasure to have you. I understand the elements that you had to pass through in order to get here, so we give you high grades for your courage. I'm very grateful for our panelists this evening, which I believe will be an amazing and wonderfully fruitful and robust conversation. I also, at this point, also want to thank Jamil Simon for having brought so many of you, and Rabbi Deborah Hirsch and Fred Bash, both of whom I've known for a long time. So I think you all received a copy of the nation-state law when you entered, and we gave it to you in English so that it should be more palpable and accessible to you. But I'd like to begin by asking our panelists what they believe was the reason that motivated the passage of this law. And are there implications in it that at the very beginning you would like to recognize? And why don't we start with you, Eugene?
So many people ask, why was this law passed now? What's the reason for it? And it's important to have some context. The law was passed now, but it was started a long time ago. It happened to clear the threshold parliamentarily this year, but it was first actually introduced over 8 years ago in the government of in the party of Tzipi Livni. Knesset member Dichter introduced it from the Kadima party. This was not originally a Netanyahu or a right-wing proposal. And the reason for it is Israel has a very strange constitution. It's a constitution that's not a constitution, and it's a constitution in pieces. Everything that a constitution deals with, the courts, the army, separation of powers, legislature, is passed in separate basic laws, one at a time, over the span of many decades. There was never one constitution that was written. And many of the almost all the things that a constitution would typically deal with, human rights, separation of powers, has already been legislated. In the 1990s, Israel passed a basic law that deals with human rights, the Human Dignity Law. But Israel never passed and never had a measure that deals with the national character of the state. To Americans, Canadians also, this might seem strange. Why do you need a national character provision? America does not have one. Canada does not have one. But such provisions are, in fact, not uncommon. Most European countries have some kind of communal character provision, either one that creates a national religion, Israel doesn't have that, or a monarchy, Israel doesn't have that, or one that proclaims national nation-state identity for the state, as many Central and Eastern European countries have. And official languages. This is a normal constitutional provision. Almost all countries have an official language. Almost no countries have more than one official language, even countries with minorities and substantial minorities. So these basic aspects, things that are found in many constitutions, Israel never had. And finally, after 70 years, it got around to it. So I think the question isn't why now or what's the need, but what took so long.
Well, we have an answer to that. It's Jewish. Jews take a long time. Saeed, what about you? What is your sense of why it passed now? And for you, what are some of the implications?
I really don't know. I'm Arab. Usually it would take us more time. I don't know. First of all, I'm just a writer. Yes, I'm not in law. I don't understand much about law, so I will be talking from my personal experience. I would say that the law was, it's a process of a lot of laws, actually, the Nakba law, the law of the committees, the law that forbidding Palestinians from marrying or unifying Palestinian families. I would say that there were several external and probably also internal reasons for the law. The externals, I can mention the demand of Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister, yes, of Israel, if you don't know that, of the recognition. He was demanding the recognition of the Palestinian, of the Jewish state, Israel as a Jewish state. And the Palestinians, of course, we might recognize the authority or sovereignty of Israel, but about its identity, it's not our goal. Or it's not our mission to recognize the character of Israel as Jewish or not, of course, because of several implications for that. So that would be probably the major one, and also some UN and some international efforts from the Palestinians. Those might be reasons for that. And then the internal ones, and they guess they would be more powerful, I think, for political reasons. There were some very really great movements in Israel, human rights movements and NGOs asking for equality, and probably someone in Israel thought that it's a little bit to ask for equality and to petition to the Supreme Court based on the equality that was mentioned in the Declaration of Independence might threaten the superiority of the Jewish people in Israel. So probably that was one of the reasons that they wanted to pass that law, and so that's in short, I think.
All right, we'll come back to some of the implications for you too, but not?
So one of the things that tends to confuse a lot about the law is people think of it, and even we saw recently with a member of Congress, think of it as the Jewish state law, even though that phrase appears nowhere. And over time, I realized that the Jewish issue tends to confuse people because the law actually says nothing about what it means to be Jewish, how to be Jewish, how to join, how to become a member of the Jewish people, who is a Jew, what does it mean to be Jewish. The law says nothing about it. The law merely talks about the right of the Jewish people to self-determination in their in their homeland, the land of Israel. And in that sense, a better name for the law would be the Zionist Bare-Bones Law, because it is really defining the bare bones of Zionism. Which is that there will be one country in the world where the Jewish people will be able to exercise their self-determination, and the law literally says nothing else. Now, I was present at creation. I was a member of Knesset. As Avi Dichter approached me one day, we sit in the plenary, another dull speech, and what members of Knesset do during such plenaries, they run around with law proposals. I don't know if you know, but in the Israeli Knesset, every member of Knesset has dozens, if not hundreds, of law proposals to their names, almost none of which get passed, but they're kind of declarations. So Avi Dichter comes to me, he shows me the bill, and I read it, and I'm like, duh, I mean, there's nothing here. It's super obvious. Yes, Israel reflects the national self-determination of the Jewish people. The flag has the Star of David. The national anthem is a tikva. The official language is Hebrew. I'm like, why do we need this? And he's like, it's part of the Constitution. And I'm like, and you know, it's also this friendly element. So I'm like, sure, whatever. I add my name to it. There's nothing special in the law. Then all hell breaks loose, and there's op-eds, and it's a racist law, and I run back to read the law, and I'm like, what did I sign that was so terrible? And I read it, and I'm like, I'm not seeing it. It's not there. And this is really what's so confusing in the law, that it's not in the law. The law is bare bones Zionism. If you think that Zionism, the universal right of the Jewish people to self-determination, is a racist endeavor, is about Jewish supremacism, then opposition to the law is not interesting, because you oppose Zionism, the law reflects Zionism. That's not interesting to me, because your opposition to the universal right of the Jewish people to self-determination emerges from other reasons. So it's not in the law. There's nothing in the law that would explain the kind of the fur and the controversy. But Syed is right that it did emerge in a particular context where Netanyahu had just given the Bar-Ilan speech. There was talk of moving towards rounds of negotiations, and yet again, the establishment of a Palestinian state. Now, the whole idea was that with the possibility of finally reaching partition, as the United Nations imagined, between an Arab state and a Jewish state, and notice Arab and Jewish, two peoples, two groups, two collectives, not religions, then in that context, it makes sense to enshrine the very purpose of partition, which is a Jewish state and an Arab state. And indeed, as Palestinians' leader said, you can define yourself however you want. The response of Israelis such as Dichter was like, okay, so let's enshrine this as part of the process of negotiating peace, so as to make it clear that the very purpose of negotiating peace, the very purpose of dividing the land into two states, is so that there is a Jewish state and an Arab state.
Obviously, we're going to come back to that issue in terms of, do we really believe there's a two-state solution now? So let's go, Peter. What about you?
So I would agree that I think context really is crucial here. I think that there were a group of people in Israel who felt that the balance, the inherent balance or tension that exists in the idea of Zionism, that exists in Israel's Declaration of Independence, between a country that will provide representation and safety for Jews and a country that believes in liberal democratic Enlightenment principles of equality, that the pendulum had swung too far towards equality, and that the Jewish side, the Jewish rights needed to be reaffirmed. I think that the problem is you have to understand the context in which this bill comes, right? The context is that millions of Palestinians live in the West Bank as non-citizens under Israeli control, under military law, without free movement or due process or the right to vote for the government that controls their lives. That the Palestinian citizens of Israel, right, inside the Green Line, often called Arab Israelis, live under a regime that is characterized by discrimination and neglect. Those aren't my words. Those are actually quoting from the Orr Commission, commissioned by the Israeli government itself back in 2003. You have a very prominent cabinet minister and politician, Avigdor Lieberman, talking about essentially forcibly removing Palestinians by annexing their village, pushing their villages outside of the state of Israel in a two-state agreement. You have Benjamin Netanyahu in 2015 running and warning the Israeli Jews that the Arabs are coming to vote in droves. Just today, we saw Netanyahu again basically telling Israeli Jews, you can't vote for Benny Gantz, he's too dangerous because the Arabs, he's got this big image of an Arab member of Knesset in his ad, might have a role in the next government. So in this context, right, in which Israel's non-Jewish and Palestinian citizens already believe that they live under discrimination, right? And if the Israeli government has said it itself, the question is it wise for Israel to pass a law that reaffirms Israel's Jewish identity without saying anything, as the Declaration of Independence does, about the principles of equality? It's well enough for kind of Israeli or American Jews to say, well, the Palestinians don't have anything to worry about. This law doesn't cause them any problems. But what you saw was an overwhelming response by Palestinian citizens of Israel in opposition to this bill. General strikes, mass protests, and I would note not only by anti-Zionist Palestinian Israelis, but indeed by Druze who served in the military, who themselves said, we as people who've served in the military and are willing to fight for this state. Right? There were protests in Tel Aviv with Druze former top Israeli military officials saying, this is a betrayal of us because it doesn't talk about equality, because it pushes that, it gets that tension balance all wrong. And I think this is, for me, it's not only a question of justice, it's a question of security for the state of Israel, right? Imagine if there were an internal intifada, an intifada inside the Green Line by Israel's Palestinian citizens. Imagine if they stopped voting, stopped serving in the Knesset, stopped serving on courts. The integration, the sense of feeling part of Israel, of this 20% of the population, is crucial to Israel's own security, and something that profoundly alienates them from a state they already feel marginal in, I think, is very dangerous.
So I want to come back to some of the things that have been mentioned. I asked initially whether you would think of some implications of at least part of the statute, right? There are certain things. There are certain lists and certain conditions in there that have caused a special upset. The issue of Arabic and the issue of settlements, however it's framed. How do you respond to that? I mean, there certainly is a change in the status of Arabic.
I think it's best that Eugene addressed that, because one of the key issues that really needs to be understood is how little is there in the law. And because there's so little, how much people project their own biases into that essentially almost blank slate. But go ahead.
Thank you. So you can look at the law yourself. It's true much is projected on it. There is not a change in the status of Arabic, and if there is a change, it's a change for the better. The language of the law says the status quo of Arabic shall be preserved. The status quo shall be preserved. What was the status quo? Israel had no legislation. The Knesset had never passed a law dealing with the languages of the country. Most countries have laws, if not constitutional provisions typically, dealing with official languages. Israel never had one. There was a certain status quo. That status quo is now stabilized and enshrined in the Constitution using the words status quo. And you can go through this Constitution provision by provision. Said made a joke, which was funny, that the Arabs would have taken longer to get around to this in more than 70 years, but that's actually not the case. If you look at the constitution of every Arab country, if you look at the constitution of the state of Palestine, which says it is an Arab country, it is a Palestinian country, Arabic is the official language, Islam is the religion. So maybe we don't want to use them as a model. If you look at European constitutions, if you look at constitutions around the world, every provision is going to be found there. So to say that provisions that are found in constitutions around the world, nobody says they're racist when they're in the Palestinian constitution, and no one says they're racist when they're in the Spanish constitution or in the Irish constitution, but when you put it in the Jewish constitution, it's racist. That itself is an act of racism against the Jews. The feelings of Israel's minorities must be taken into regard, but the feelings of Israel's majority must be taken in regard, because Israel is the only country in which the Jews are a majority, the only country in which they can affect their national self-determination. And if there are rights that people exercise around the world, to a language, to a flag, to an anthem, and it turns out Israel, which is not the only country in the world with a minority, is somehow barred from having that, that's a real problem.
Sayed, did you want to respond?
I'm not sure, because I'm not sure about the taste actually to respond. It's the same thing also to responding to the law of nationality. I think that mixing so much examples from so different countries and disconnecting the history, the historical fact of Palestine and Israel would be just a demagogic thing in order to just to justify any Israeli policy. It's not, again, I think that yes, every Palestinian, every Israel would say, oh, so what's big about it? Well, we know you're discriminated, so what's the big thing about the law? Yes, it is. Somehow, I would say that many of the Palestinians would say, yeah, we knew that we are not accepted here as citizens. But the law, I think here, it is making some de facto realities to the jure, which will limit. Yes, after all, yes, it's how the court is going to how courts in Israel and judges in Israel going to use the law in their decisions. Or but when we talk about the Arabic language, for of course, again, it's really not clear why to declare that in the law if it's not downgrading the Arabic language. It was a formal language since the mandate, but now it's a special language in Israel. Why doing that if you are not intending to downgrade the Arabic language? We have also to remember that the Arabic language is not only the language of the Palestinian citizens of Israel. It's the language of 50%, the original language of 50%, and wonderful Jewish writing were written in Arabic during the years. Why eliminate that? Why make the Mizrahi Jews feel that they're not being connected to their culture and their language? Why make that? And why also to declare and downgrade the Arabic language status, even if it's just official thing, when you live in the Middle East? Israel seeks peace with the Middle East and the countries and whatever, but why declare that? What is that will mean to Arab countries surrounding Israel, even if it doesn't mean anything? So why put it in a new law that it's now downgraded? It was a formal language for, I don't know, 95 years since the mandate. Now it's less. Why to give that if you just don't want to this hierarchy? Who's in role, who's inferior, and who's superior in that country? Just like making it sure. Yes, of course, probably in the daily life, nothing would matter. Arabs were not welcomed in Moshavim and Kibbutzim and any other places, although they are trying to live in Afula and Nazaret Alit and Kermel, and they are not welcome. There is the law of committees, but now we are telling you that you are not welcome. If you were thinking, those of you who were thinking about multicultural, inside the State of Israel, by the way, so forget about it. To think about different languages, different cultures, united in the State of Israel, and not only for the Palestinians, for the Mizrahi Jews, for the Hasidic Jews, you can forget about that multicultural, democratic, multicultural society in Israel. So why do that? And of course, there are in the law, yes, some scary things. What is Israel? Who is the only people, yes, which is to exercise their nationality are the Jewish people. What are the borders of Israel, as Peter mentioned here? Is it including Palestine and Gaza? What is the implication of what's the meaning of the law when we have powerful neo-Zionists behind this law, of course, the nationality calling to impose the Israeli law in the West Bank, maybe not Gaza, but in the West Bank. What does that mean about Palestinians in the West Bank, about their national identity? Isn't the fact, okay, you have your individual rights, isn't the fact that if you are Jewish, you have this collective right to identify with the State of Israel as a Jewish state? Doesn't that make you a superior and not equal citizen? And is there any, even the name Israel, of course, it's very Jewish, is there any place for a civil society that people can identify with the State of Israel, with its flag, with its anthem, its symbols? And of course, symbols, they have a lot of power and meanings. But what is the part of a civil society here? It is something that says to the Arabs, you are less, and we want you to believe that and know that you are less. It's not a law that it's bringing or it's not the law of what is Israelness. No, it's about to be Israeli, meaning to be Jewish. And
Saeed, I think Peter would like to draw. I'm just watching him.
No, I feel like in a way the proponents of the law are trying to have it both ways, right? On the one hand, you say, well, this is just about Jewish self-determination, and Eugene talks about the state of Palestine has its own character, right? As in its constitution about Islam and about Arabic, et cetera. But the whole point, of course, is that there is no state of Palestine, right? And that Israel does not have defined borders, right? So it's one thing to say we're going to define and say that we're going to pass a law now about Jewish self-determination when Palestinians also have self-determination, right? But remember, Israel has not defined its borders, right? And the vast majority of people pushing this bill do not ever want to see a Palestinian state exist, right? There were some centrists who supported this bill who might have been two-staters. They almost all, including some Druze actually, they all jumped off it when it became clear that it was not going to have any reference to equality to it. So the vast majority of people pushing this bill are people from the Likud and to the right, people vehemently opposed to any existence of Palestinian national self-determination, and people who believe that the borders of Israel should essentially run from the river to the sea. That's very important to understand when you see in the bill phrases like, the right to exercise national self-determination in the state of Israel is uniquely that of the Jewish people. It's one thing if you're saying that inside the Green Line. It's another thing if that's being pushed by a whole series of politicians who believe that that includes the West Bank too, right? Or a phrase that says, the state views the development of Jewish settlement as a national value and shall encourage and promote it, right? Does that include the settlements in the West Bank? For most of the people who push this law, absolutely it does. Which means that it's in the name of giving Jews national self-determination, which Jews in Israel already have, you are trampling on the possibility of Palestinian national self-determination.
And you had talked, in fact, to follow up with Peter's statement, you had talked about the two states, and that it makes sense if there was a partition, that partition was part of the plan. Can you speak further about that?
And that is precisely the issue between the elements here. Because if we agree, and that is still a big if for some people, that there is illegitimacy to self-determination to the Jewish people. And for some people, that is not legitimate in any border. And it masks itself under names of multiculturalism or democracy. But it basically, there's this notion that the idea of Jews being a people, not a religion, like all people with the right to self-determine in their homeland, is something that still grates on many groups and peoples. There's something somehow deeply wrong about it. But if we do accept it, then here, and I did not expect to do it, I do agree with Peter. Because
I'm sure it won't happen again.
Yeah, well, because
this is being recorded.
Yes. Because indeed, between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, there are two groups. Whatever each thinks about the invented nature of the other, they seem to violently agree that they are not the other. So they are both have the equal right to either be equal citizens in one state or be citizens in two states. My preferred direction, simply because I do believe that the Jewish people have the universal right to self-determination. And generally, I think Jews being a powerless minority in an Arab country was not the purpose of Zionism. But once you have two states, then it should be understood that one is Jewish and one is Arab. It is not against democracy. It is not against the equality of the citizens. But for example, you're right, if you enshrine equality and you don't say the borders, then this is something that I don't want. Because I don't want a bill that is promoted by people who want an Israel from the river to the sea, and then there is equality in it, and then the Jews become a minority in an Arab state. So for me, the legitimacy of this bill can only come once Israel indeed delineates its final eastern border, and regardless of whether the Palestinians are ready to accept the true idea of partition, that this land will be divided between the equal sovereign Jewish people and the equal sovereign Palestinians, even if that doesn't happen, if Israel delineates an eastern border, leaving room for a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, the nation-state bill within that is very legitimate. And indeed, this is why I moved from 8 years ago to signing the bill and defending it as merely bare-bones Zionism, because that was in the context of a government and a speech and negotiations of moving to partition in that spirit of a Jewish state and an Arab state.
So time and context make a difference here.
They entirely make the difference, precisely because there's so little in the law. I mean, there's very, very little in it. Context makes all the difference. Indeed, the law has been, after laying dormant for quite some time, it was not exactly pushed all the time. It lay dormant for quite some time, and then it was picked up by people who do indeed have a vision that of one state from the river to the sea, where Palestinians will not have the right to self-determination, but they also don't have the liberal vision, in my view, naive liberal vision of our president of one state where everyone can be equal citizens, and Jews and Arabs will not descend into Yugoslavia or Syria. So because they don't have this vision and they promoted the law, I started to oppose it, but with a very clear claim. I do not oppose what's in the law. I'm not an anti-Zionist. I'm a very proud and comfortable Zionist. And I do believe that the Jewish people have that universal right, but it also has to be clear that the Arab Palestinians have the universal right. Within our borders, we can exercise that collective right. They can exercise that collective right, and the law becomes legitimate only under leadership and people who have a vision of partition.
You know, I don't expect that you'll be political analysts, but I looked at the vote. I mean, we look at the vote. So it was 62 in favor, and I think 45 against, and there were 3 abstentions, and
I think 50-something against.
Yeah. And one no-show. Which would indicate that there wasn't a huge plurality, right? It was closer than one would have imagined, which would seem to indicate that there was dissension, significant dissension within the Knesset itself. How did that break down?
But it was precisely on this issue. this is the other thing, and this is more political machinations. Netanyahu realized that because a lot of people like myself moved away from supporting the bill, because it began to be promoted by people who have a very particular vision, which I think is dangerous, he saw it as a great political opportunity to drive a wedge. Under normal conditions, a leader would want to pass the law under the biggest majority possible, because this is the one thing you want to show to the world where you have wide support. That the one thing that the vast majority of Israelis agree on is that Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people and can exercise that self-determination. But Netanyahu was actually interested in not having that. He actually made a point of not, for example, introducing the idea of equality or others in the law in order to not enable parties like Kadima, like the Labour Party to support it, because he wanted to be able, and this is exactly what he did, is to say, look, these people, they don't support our anthem. They don't support the flag. And that was suddenly a great way to kind of send them out of the consensus, paint them as traitors, and basically be the party of the anthem and the flag. And that was really a lot of politics and why he was actually very pleased with this kind of thin, razor-thin majority.
And I'm sure it wasn't planned, but there was something symbolic, I think, about Orban, coming from Hungary right before the vote. I mean, Viktor Orban, in terms of, kind of a nationalist, somebody who represents a nationalist, populist movement. So let me turn to, the way Israelis would think about what this bill means to American Jews, because it plays out here. Right? There was tremendous dissension here. There were, a number of op-ed pieces about it. One can certainly say, who cares, right, about American Jews? But on the other hand, there is a growing sense of a division between Israeli Jews and American Jews, and this just added to it. Would that seem a correct analysis?
It's important to consider how this affects American Jews. It's also important to understand that how it affects American Jews is not something that is fixed or comes from the sky. Different groups have different interests in having this affect American Jews in different ways. We often hear that there's a growing rift between American Jews and Israel, but the part of that is, I think, manufactured. There are many people who would like there to be a rift between American Jews and Israel, and will do things such as misrepresent the contents of this law. For example, many American Jews may never have seen the contents of this law until today. There is a weaponization of creating a rift. For example, let's discuss the issue of equality. It might seem, American Jews might be very alarmed to hear that Israel passed a basic law dealing with national character that doesn't include equality. But they might not be aware that the Israeli Constitution already protects equality. The Supreme Court has long held that equality is protected by the Constitution. And indeed, when one of the opposition parties, challenged the basic law for being unconstitutional, what was their argument? They said it's unconstitutional because it violates the constitutional protection of equality. But wait, I thought equality is not protected by the Constitution. So equality is already in there. That's why it wasn't put in. Getting back to the American Jews. The rift is purely a function of how it's reported and how it's perceived. If one focuses, there was opposition to the law. That sounds scary. Opposition to a law, that's a problem. So in Israel, as in America, we have a system for dealing with situations where some people like an idea and other people don't. Where there's one group who's for it, one group who's against it. And it's called democracy and the Knesset. 61 votes is pretty good. It's more than a lot of other basic laws have gotten. And when you have people with different views, how do you reconcile them? Through the democratic process. Now, Israelis are very concerned, of course, about American Jewry. And if American Jews are told that Israel has passed a fascist apartheid law that happens to be like the laws of most countries in the world, but for Israel it's bad, it's unacceptable. Yes, that will drive them away from Israel. But again, like everything about this discussion, it's not because of anything in the law, it's about the spin. The contents of the law are not what's driving the wedge, it's the spin on the law. And I would encourage American Jews to ask themselves. So Peter and I already agreed on something, again also, this is going to be great progress. So we disagree, Peter, we agree, it seems. Peter says that the Palestinian Constitution...
Peter.
Yeah. Peter agrees that the Palestinian Constitution isn't a problem because he says there is no state of Palestine. The UN, most countries in the world would disagree, but that's just on the question of, have they achieved sovereignty yet? But if these provisions are so problematic, a religion, Israel does not have an official religion, an official single language, a national character, then surely American Jews should find themselves very distressed to be calling for the creation of a state of Palestine, which on its first day will be an apartheid state under every provision of its constitution. So American Jew, because it has all this, unless they're going to change the constitution the day they achieve statehood, American Jews need to understand that Israel has an existence outside of the conflict with the Palestinians. So we talked about where does this law apply? What's the effect of this law in the West Bank, for example? The answer to that is very clear. There is no need to be concerned about its effect on the West Bank because Israel has a clear legal rule. Acts of Knesset do not apply in the West Bank. This is not about the West Bank. It does not apply to the West Bank. And Israel has a right today, Israeli democracy, to govern itself and not be held hostage to negotiations and diplomatic processes with the Palestinians. Israel existed before the conflict with the Palestinians, and it has an existence that is separate from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, though in America that may be how many people choose to see.
I'm going to need your kind of legal expertise here because just to clarify some language, you talk about Israel has a constitution, right? The fact is that it doesn't have a constitution as we may imagine a constitution. It has a set of basic laws.
It has a quasi-constitution in little pieces.
Right, rolling over time, and basic laws that have been passed over time, which you're then talking about in a corporate way as the Constitution. Right?
Yeah, and the point that has been raised that maybe it should have more votes, it should have more consensus, this gets to the heart of not a problem with this basic law, but with the entire Israeli constitutional system. Basic laws, unlike American constitutional provisions, which need supermajority support because they trump legislation, Constitution beats a law, so the Constitution needs to get more votes. When I say quasi-constitution, every Israeli basic law is passed by a majority. That's not a good system. It's better to have a system in which a law that trumps another law is passed by a supermajority, but that's never been a feature. That's not a feature. We wouldn't have half the basic laws if that were a feature, and that is nothing special to this basic law. That is just the weird fits and starts nature of Israeli constitutionalism.
I think in a certain way, Saeed and you, Peter, probably have the best able to answer the question I'm going to ask about kind of the youth of this country, right? Especially even Jewish youth of this country and how they perceive it and what difference does it make to them in terms of where we see kind of the next generation of Jews in this country moving. Any sense of how this law and the talk about this law has impacted people on the campus, for instance? Birthright trips.
I usually don't go into internal debates, which I'm doing right now about what the American Jews. But I'm really very happy to know that Israel that equality in Israel is really very powerful apparently, and that also there is no problem called occupation, and it's not about Palestine or people calling to impose the law there, and we don't have to care also about parts of the law calling to it's the national duty of Israel to develop Jewish settlements inside Israel, and I saw also different variations of the law before that. Actually, it was calling for segregation between Palestinians and Israelis, and yes, one of the reasons maybe that they established the law was because of more Arabs want to live because of their poverty. And because not even one Arab village, not that I'm calling to establish separated places for the Arabs. And because people who want to live in Afula, I'm sure that you follow that stories, or in Carmiel or in Nazaret Elite, yes, face demonstrations with politicians forbidding Arabs to live in Israeli cities, not to talk about kibbutzim and the law of committees. And that was, yes, the Qa'dan petition and the Supreme Court decision back then that Arab, yes, he needs to go to petition to Supreme Court in order to live in a Jewish state. And we don't want to change the Jewish state or the character of Jewish state. Most of the Arabs who want to live in Afula and Nazaret Elite really want to be part, and they are rejected time after time. And again, about the legitimacy of the Jewish people, legitimacy, I think, should be, yes, of course, nationality, artificial and constructed as it might be, but it's a reality that we have to deal with. But I don't think that there is something called a legitimacy for national, that's the national discourse, which I agree, that's the reality. But I think the legitimacy of the State of Israel to exist as the determination of Jewish people should be by the acts, by the ethical acts, by the moral acts. You are not expecting all Palestinians to become Zionists like Benjamin Netanyahu in order maybe to end the occupation. Maybe it's different. Maybe if we see different approach, and maybe if we see different, and honestly, probably some Arabs would not in this discourse would like to say that, but since 1948, the majority of the Arabs wanted to be citizens, equal citizens in the State of Israel. Now I know that actually we are equal citizens in the State of Israel, so I'm relaxed. Regarding the law that concerns, yes, there are still most of the, when I'm asked to talk to YPAC, they're really my students in the classes that I called Advanced Hebrew with Arabic accent that I teach in universities, and I love my students, and they're, of course, they grew up in a very Zionist houses, but you see the J Street and different voices concerned about that. My 50 cent regarding the internal, I think it's very clear in the law, written that for the Haredic people, it was changed several times because of the reform and the reformic and the conservative Judaism in the states. So actually, in the law, if you read it, of course, it says that we will support the Jewish identities around the world, but in the diasporic Jewish, but not in Israel. It's kept in the hands of the Haredic people and the definition of what is Judaism in the state of Israel. It relates to the diaspora in a different way that it relates to Judaism in Israel. So that's something that, yes, of course, was meant to also, to deal with the Haredic in Israel, and also with different kind of concept of Judaism in the diaspora.
Einat, I saw you shaking your head.
Because there is a glossing here of really on a lot of the fundamental issues. Often when I speak to Americans about national self-determinations, about nation states, about the term that has become here, so like ethno-nationalism, and then I have to tell them that's nationalism. But in America, Americans, because America is different, Americans are under the impression that the world looks like America. And I often have to remind Americans that America is the exception rather than the rule. The vast majority of the earth's land is divided between nation states where there is a kind of overlapping and unity of the various elements of the collective, of people, ethnicity, language, and sometimes even religion. And in that context, the idea that there is something particularly offensive about Jewish nationalism or Jewish self-determination, that is the question that people need to ask. Why that grates on their sensibilities? And also in the context of our region. Yes, there is no problem that every state is Arab, and yet we do need to acknowledge that at the core of the conflict remains the fact that the Arab world and the Palestinians within that refuse to acknowledge the equal and legitimate right of the Jewish people to self-determination in their ancient homeland, and even part of it. So that part, that remains at the core. There has never been a moment. You have phrases like Israel's right to exist or Israel, but when you go to the core of it, of saying, do you accept that the Jewish people as a people, we're not a religion, as a people have the same universal right that all or so many peoples enjoy around the world, to be masters of their fate in their own state, and therefore to divide the land between the two legitimate presences, the two indigenous peoples of this land. To date, the answer has been no, there's no legitimacy to that. And that is a very different discussion, which is why I say if people oppose that, then their opposition to the law is not interesting, because the law becomes merely just one more way to rail against Zionism, against the basic idea that Jews have a right to power, Jews have a right to sovereignty, and Jews have a right to equality among the nations. Then that is outside. So this is, if people who are not from either citizens of the state of Israel or from the Jewish people rail against it, it's really none of their business. There's nothing unique or special about Jewish self-determination that should be opposed. Within the family, we go into the discussion about really the debate about the conflict, the borders, those who have a different vision. But once you accept the idea that there are two peoples with two legitimate rights to self-determination, everything else really falls into place.
Let me just, I have some facts here, some polls, very recent polls, that when it comes to accepting Israel as a nation of Jews, 2/3 of Jerusalem Arabs accept it, only 1/3 of West Bank Arabs accept it, and interestingly, 55% of Gazans accept Israel as a nation of Jews. So this, by the way, this came from Steve Boehm, who I respect as a, as a qualified keeper of this data. So there is that sense, and I think part of the discussion I think that's happening in the country is that tension that's always been there about Israel as a democracy and Israel as a Jewish state. And that somehow that is, is perceived, not necessarily as we listen to this, a reality, but perceived as a tension that's really in jeopardy now.
I'll just say a couple things. I mean, the PLO accepted Israel's right to exist in 1993, right? And all of the Arab countries in the Arab Peace Initiative accepted Israel's right to exist if there was a two-state solution and what they called a just and agreed-upon solution to the refugee question, right? No, actually, that's. In fact, that is, in fact, the case. Now, the claim about accepting Israel as a Jewish state, that's true. That has not been accepted. But I just want to get to a couple other points. Look, I am a Zionist, maybe not exactly the same kind of Zionist as Eugene and Einat, but a Zionist, and I believe in a certain kind of Jewish state. But let's not pretend that the right to national self-determination is universal. It's not universal. The Kurds don't have a state. They want one. The Basques don't have a state. The Scots don't have a state. The Kashmiris don't have a state. The Igbo don't have a state. The Palestinians don't have a state, right? And many of the people most fervently devoted to Jewish self-determination want to deny them a state, right?
But they all demand a state in the name of that right.
Well, we do not say that someone is an anti-Kurdish bigot because they don't want to carve a Kurdish state out of Iraq, Iran, Turkey, and Syria, right? The point is national self-determination, ethnically, nationally based, are one way of trying to respond to people's needs for the things that states provide. Security, representation. I think the best solution, and I agree with this, would be a two-state solution. There would be tension between the idea of equality and liberal democracy on the one hand and national self-representation in both the Jewish state and the Palestinian state, if we're lucky enough to get to that point. But at a certain point, when the tension is too great, when a state's desire to represent one group of people comes too profoundly at the expense of the other people that exist in that state, then it is time to think about other options. I hope we will not get there. But when Einat says she's not interested in people who have problems with this bill because they're not Zionists, what you're saying, Einat, is you are not interested in the 20% of your own citizens of your countrymen and women who are not Jews, who are not Zionists, could not be Zionists by and large because it's a Jewish national self-determination. And I would suspect you should be interested because you have to live alongside those people and you should care about their dignity and their livelihood. Because if you don't, it will come back to hurt the state of Israel very badly.
All right, Einat, you have a... All right. We said at the beginning this is going to be civil conversation, and that goes for those in the audience as well. Yeah,
absolutely. So the idea that at any point the Palestinian leadership or their Arabs recognized Israel in the sense of, again, the principle of partition between a Jewish state and an Arab state doesn't stand to scrutiny. And it all emerges from this idea that the Palestinians call a right of return, which actually doesn't exist. But when Arab leaders, and they all say that they recognize Israel, or in the Arab Peace Initiative, or they support two states, but that the Palestinians have this thing called a right of return, which effectively would make Jews a minority in an Arab state, then the only two states they have ever supported or recognized is an Arab state in the West Bank and Gaza and an Arab state to replace Israel. A true recognition of the equal right of the Jewish people as equal claimants to the land never existed, and therefore there was never, as a result, an agreement. So this, and we should not gloss over it because this is at the core. This is the reason we do not have an agreement. So this really goes to why we need to discuss this. And yes, when 20% of Israel's citizens, when I'm saying I actually don't think that they cannot be Zionist, it is something that I think we take from, to be a Zionist is to simply think that the Jewish people, like all peoples, have the universal right to self-determination. And when the Basque and the Kurds and others and Palestinians fight for it, they fight in the name of what we consider by now a universal ideal. So when there is opposition, if you believe that, you're a Zionist. You do not need to be Jewish to be a Zionist. And I would even, and within Israel's citizens, there is nothing to prevent someone who's not Jewish to be a Zionist. Druze, indeed, many Druze define themselves as Zionists, as supporters of the right of the Jewish people to self-determination. You do not need to be Jewish to be a Zionist. And indeed, we need to take into consideration those who are Zionist and feel that the bill somehow, again, it's not in the bill, but everything needs to be done to make sure that they feel that they're a part. But there are those who would never feel that they are a part, because for them nothing less than the complete dismantlement of the idea that the Jewish people have the right to self-determination would suffice. And for those whom that's the vision, indeed, I can't share.
You know, because we're coming to the time limit that we set for ourselves, I think it would be proper if we had Saeed and then Eugene, you kind of add your words to this.
And you were in the Labour Party? Anyway. It's just, it's again, as I was said, you are expecting all Arabs to become Zionist in order to maybe to end occupation, and then I don't know. So you agree very much with the law if you don't see any problem with equality or the fact that the citizen is defined by. Yes, of course, it's complicated, and Judaism is not only a religion, but at least it's also a religion, which makes it much more complicated than other places. Is there a chance for me? I want to be Israeli. You know what?
You are Israeli.
Yes. But this law tells me that you are Israeli, but you are less Israeli.
It doesn't tell you that. It's your feeling.
Yes,
but it doesn't tell you that.
If I read that if I belong to the Jewish people, I have some collective rights that you don't deserve as a Palestinian. Yes, so I'm less. I don't belong to the Jewish people, unless also, besides asking for all the Palestinians and the Arabs to become Zionists, maybe we will convert them. I will agree with that also to Judaism. Yes, of course. This is the problem. And again, you cannot talk about rights. You cannot talk about nationality as it's a born right or a human right. Disconnecting that from, it's like a barber who is really cutting you very badly. He's really a very bad barber, and you are shouting there, and he said, "Do you deny my right to open a barber shop here in New York?" You cannot disconnect the fact that you are occupying the Palestinian people, that you are making the citizens of Israel Israel second, and neglecting them and telling them all the time, non-stop, that you don't belong and you will never belong, that you are a demographic threat. Although we want, even the Druze, the Zionist Druze, of course, there is the Druze Globe, they really love Israel, they consider themselves as Zionists, and they are still rejected. Look at the demonstration happened there. And that's about the law. It's saying, if you are Jewish, you have more rights. If you are a Jewish, this state is for you. All the rest do not belong here, and this state is not for you. It is, by the way, in the law, it is the state of any Jewish who have a Jewish mother, but it's not the state of the citizens of that state. And I'm not sure in how many societies this description or definition of citizenship connected still with religion is really accurate.
Right.
So that's the problem. And again, the legitimacy of the state of Israel, it cannot be disconnected from the colonial function, and it cannot be connected from history. And yes, if Israel will act accordingly, if Israel really show the Palestinians and the Arabs, can you remember the Oslo Agreement and the hopes and we dancing in the streets? Maybe naive, maybe because we were the peace group wanting to believe that it will happen. Yes, we were very proud of it. And you can fool people. And they think that the Palestinian people went so much to compromise about the historical Palestine. Yes, the majority of the Palestinian people back then, including the PLO and Yasser Arafat, you can shake your head as you want. You are occupying the Palestinian people, not me, and you're asking us to be Zionist, maybe to stop occupation. Are there things that you agree to do immediately? For example, not settling in the West Bank and Gaza and ending the occupation without any condition or recognition of the Palestinian people, just based on the international law. If you're confused with ethics, just follow the international law in that sense. It's not fair to talk about equality, about about the legitimacy of Israel. I wish that Israel would be, but the legitimacy of the state of Israel, it's the exercise and the policy and the attitude. Not when the Israel, since I don't know when, and it's just getting worse, telling you that we'll never belong here. You don't belong here. We are not going to give you a state. Settlements are just getting bigger, and they listen to the discourse in the political situation. You cannot ignore that. You cannot connect that from the Palestinians or the Arab world, given the legitimacy of the state of Israel.
We're going to give, and then we'll come back. Hopefully we'll have an opportunity to close the conversation after some questions. Eugene?
I think I would summarize much of this discussion by saying, heads I win, tails you lose. For the past 2,000 years, the Jews were a people, not just a religion, a people without a country. In every country they found themselves in, they were a minority. They could not exercise the powers and rights that people can exercise in political collectives as a majority. That caused many and well-known problems and unhappinesses. After a long time, the Jews managed to, through their own efforts, regain national sovereignty. I want to relate briefly to Peter's Kurdish example. If the Kurds were, through their own efforts, to succeed in creating a Kurdish state, I think one would certainly be quite anti-Kurdish and against Kurdish nationalism if one were to say then the Kurds were disbarred from keeping that state because the Arab minority in that state would be unhappy, or that they would not be able to have Kurdish as the official language of a state they achieved themselves because there would be an Arab minority who didn't like it, and no one would ever make such a suggestion. Which shows how absurd it is. So the Jews regain sovereignty, and they're now no longer a minority. But now there's a minority in the state of Israel. And guess what? Having a minority for the Jews means the exact same thing as being a minority. Being a minority means you cannot legislate according to the majority. You're not the majority. And when you're in the majority, you can't legislate according to the majority because now you have a minority. So when you're a minority, you're politically powerless. And if you have a minority, you're disbarred from political power. The bottom line is the Jews are disbarred from political power. I think it's very important. I do not discount the feelings of anyone who objects to this law. But in a democracy, there's so people feel very strongly. Peter says 20%. I mean, the Arab parties in the Knesset are not 20% of the Knesset. They're 10% of the Knesset. There are many Arabs who do vote for Zionist parties. But let's say 20% of the population opposes this law very passionately. But let's say many Jews, the majority indeed, passionately support this as the realization of their historic hopes, and they're only, how do you deal with these incompatible feelings? Who is to say one feeling is stronger or more right than the other? So it's impossible to deal with conflicting preferences and measure their intensities. We don't have in politics a preference measurer. So what we do is we show up in Parliament and we vote by a majority. And that's exactly what happened. But when the majority vote is disbarred, despite the fact that it does not take away anyone's individual rights, despite the fact that it does not give additional rights to any Jew or take away any rights from an Arab, then we might say, then we see the need for this law. I have to say, I was skeptical of the need for this law until it was passed.
So when
the law was passed, I said, who needs to say that Israel is a Jewish state? Doesn't everybody know? But when Israel finally declares, when Israel comes out of the closet, so everyone supposedly knew, it's a Jewish state, not allowed to say it. When Israel comes out and says what everybody knew, and you see the reaction of the world, hey, you're not allowed to say that. Lithuania is allowed to say that, Latvia is allowed to say that, Spain's allowed to say that, you're not allowed to say that? That's why we need to say it.
So we're going to move into a couple of questions that have come from I was going to say the congregation, but the audience. Habits don't die.
It's always a congregation.
Right, it's always a congregation. And it really kind of in a way relates, Eugene, to what you were talking about. The question is, how do secular Israelis relate to a Jewish agenda? Do they care about the law? In other words, if one was to do an assessment of the people of Israel, are there people who just couldn't care? Do secular Israelis not care about?
I mean, secular Jewish Israelis.
Secular Jewish Israelis.
It's a secular law. This law has absolutely nothing to do with religion. Other than Shabbat being a day of rest, which is an ordinary blue law type provision, there is no religious content to this. It was passed by secular parties. The Haredi parties were not involved and not particularly excited. It's a secular law. It was passed by a secular majority against a secular minority. There's an entirely internal secular conflict that has nothing to do with religion.
So now,
I'll just add to that. This goes to the confusion I started with, that perhaps it's better not to discuss this law as the Jewish state law, which it's not, but really think of it as the law of Zionism. And Zionism is, at its heart, a secular idea. I always like to mention that I'm a devout atheist. The notion that there's anything about religion in this law does not exist. So for secular Israelis, the question is not about the law. Secular Israelis are intensely Zionist.
Israeli Jews.
Secular Israeli Jews are intensely Zionists, except for a small minority that is not. And for them, the question of the law, again, is not whether they support the right of the Jewish people to self-determination. Of course they do. It's what they're concerned about, the fact that it's being used by the extreme right as the building block of a future annexationist agenda.
So I'm going to, because it's a question, but we're asking you to prophesy, right, and the impossible. The question is nothing less than, how will the conflict ever end?
Oh, I can do that.
All right, go ahead. You want to do that?
Yeah. So first of all, if you want, there's a video I have on YouTube which is called "What is the conflict really about and how will it end?" But the conflict will end based on the outcome of the race we're currently engaged in, which is a race for mutual exhaustion. At the core of the conflict remains the idea that the Jewish people are a foreign and therefore temporary presence in the land. And that is at the core of it, and that explains the repeated refusals to accept anything that would legitimize the Jewish people as a legitimate, indigenous, sovereign, powerful presence. So what we are engaged in, and have been engaged for over 100 years, is a race of mutual exhaustion, whereby the Arab world more broadly is trying to exhaust the Jewish people into basically leaving, and thereby legitimizing the notion that Israel is the second Crusader state, a foreign temporary presence. And we are trying to exhaust the other side into finally letting us be, into accepting that, as crazy as it is, we are an indigenous people who have come home, that this is our homeland. We are not foreigners. We are not some white settler European colonialists. This is our home. We don't need all of it. There are two peoples in this land, but we do need to know that we are secure and accepted in part of it, and accepted as equals. The idea that you sometimes hear, we have no problem with Jews, only with Zionists. That means we have a problem with Jews who want power, with Jews who want equality. We want to be accepted not as a powerless minority that knows its place. That everyone is willing to accept us as. We want to be accepted as a sovereign people who are finally masters of our fate. And if you allow me for a minute, I do a little thought experiment for right-wing settlers, for all those who think that Israel has gone to the right, there will never be peace, and so forth. Tell them, look, let's imagine this scenario. The Saudi king, sick and decrepit, does a Sadat. He comes to the Knesset, flanked by the king of Jordan and the king of Morocco. And they give this speech. We're done. We thought you were foreigners. We fought you. Military invasion, terrorism, economic boycotts, UN condemnations, intellectual warfare. But you stuck it out. You seem to have really gotten into your heads that this is your home. So, welcome home. We recognize that you are indeed, you belong to this land. That you are a tribe of this region like other tribes. That your language, Hebrew, is a sister to our own. You belong here, and we will fight you no more. We will no longer try to get you to leave. You will have your state. But you got to get out of the West Bank. At that split second, Jews who are living in the West Bank will run so quickly into Israel that the few settlers who think that their way of life has won will look back and will find no one. And when I tell that to settlers, they say, we know. We know that if Israel finally faces a real, true opportunity to be accepted in the region as equal and sovereign, and the price of that would be to hand over the West Bank, to forgo the settlements, we know they'll pay it, just like they did in 37 and in 47, and after 67 and 2000 and 2008. We know they'll do it. We just don't think that such a speech is forthcoming anytime soon, so we're safe. But it really shows you that at the core of it, the Jews are a small, tiny minority in the region. And the conflict will end at the moment that we know that we have finally been accepted and can rest as an indigenous people who have come home and accepted as equal, sovereign, and masters of our fate.
And firstly, I'm grateful you did that, because I'm going to give the other three really just a minute each to leave with us the thought or question you think we should be leaving here mulling over. You did that for us just now. Eugene, do you want to try that?
Sorry.
I think the most valuable thing we've accomplished here tonight is put in your hands a copy of the nation-state law. I want you to read it. You should also, if you read the constitutions of some European countries, see how much in common they have, see if anything that has been said about the law is contained in the law. It's really a big deal to be able to invalidate democratic majorities' ability to pass a law by saying, it's not okay because we think you're doing it, your reasons are bad, you're bad, or the context is bad. Israel is the only country in which Jews are a majority. It doesn't have Judaism as an official religion. It can at least have Hebrew as an official language. If we don't allow the majority in Israel to enact legislation that any other country would enact, we have to ask the question: why are we so concerned about Israel? I'll end with an anecdote. Einat and I had a debate in front of 27 European deputy heads of mission in Israel. And they were attacking provisions of this law which their own countries had in their constitution. And one has to ask, is this really about what's in the law, or is this an attempt to delegitimize Israel further, to cast it in a bad light amongst American Jews and amongst the community of nations?
Thank you. Saeed, what about you?
About the
Just one question or thought you would like to think we should leave here mulling over as we leave.
Just look at the reality, and don't try to justify using discourses from pre-modern state definitions and to the modern state definitions of nationality, of people 2,000 years ago. And I think that again, they just look at the at the reality, and instead of, I'm not sure. I think that the king of Saudi and maybe of Morocco, haven't they come to the Knesset yet to declare that? I don't know. I think that it was very clear. I think in a lot of statements done by Arab leaders. Yes, you deny the wonderful Saudi peace deal, and you deny
the Saudi peace initiative continues the idea of the right of return,
the relationship between Saudi and Jordan and Morocco and Egypt with the state of Israel, and we are here actually neglecting, of course, yes, messianic Jewish extreme right wing that do not see the reality like that. They do see their mission as something from heaven, from God, about the land of Israel. Please don't ignore the fact that there are lives of Palestinians there, and please don't, when you talk about the legitimacy of the state of Israel, disconnect it from the historical facts and how that affects and still affecting the Palestinians. And yes, it is in the hands of Israel. And yes, the powerful is the one who implies or imposes the discourse and the rhythm and the hope in that region. And that's the reason I guess that I blame Israel, or put it, because they have the power. And I'm sure that the Palestinian people are thirsty and looking forward to have peace and someone to trust. And they are the one who are under occupation, and that, not the opposite. They are the minorities,
Peter?
not the opposite.
I kept thinking when Einat was giving this vision about how that would apply to a marriage. Essentially, I say to my wife, look, once you've given me everything I want, without me doing anything first, everything will be wonderful, right? I don't know. There's an abdication of any notion that Israel itself actually should be doing has any responsibility to do anything different. I don't know, crazy thoughts. Maybe stop paying Israeli Jews to move into the West Bank to steal Palestinians' land, right? Maybe change a blockade that has led to a situation in Gaza where by 2020 it will be uninhabitable according to the United Nations. Right? Maybe have an Israeli prime minister who says that he actually supports a Palestinian state as opposed to having one who repeatedly says he opposes one. Right? It seems to me, yes, there are Palestinian and Arab obligations. If you want to test who has gone further, Benjamin Netanyahu or the PLO or even the Saudi regime in terms of recognizing the national rights of the other, it's not even close. Okay? In terms of what I would want people to take away, I would say this. What you don't say is often as important as what you do say, right? You notice on this panel we keep referring to Israelis when we mean Israeli Jews, right? That's an example of what you don't say actually mattering. You just erase people, right? It's as if Israeli equals Jew, right? One of the things that people don't like, I understand, about the BDS movement is that in the BDS movement statements, they make references to Arab and Palestinian self-determination and don't make references to Jewish self-determination. They might say, we haven't said we're against Jewish self-determination, we just happen not to mention it.
They do, they
right?
demand return.
No, actually, not in the three planks. If the United States government passes a law and basically says, here's the rights of Christians in the United States, we haven't said Jews have any fewer rights. We just didn't mention them, right? There's always been a tension. There's a tension in Israel's and a balance in Israel's Declaration of Independence. It was in the earlier law for basic dignity and liberty, which talked about liberty and dignity, but also talked about Jewish statehood. Always this balance. This is what is lacking in this bill. The The silence speaks volumes about a political leadership in Israel that wants permanent control over millions of Palestinians in the West Bank whose legal status will be worse than African Americans in Mississippi in the 1950s, because those African Americans were at least theoretically citizens of the state under which they lived. Palestinians in the West Bank, not even theoretically citizens of the state that dominates their lives, and want Palestinians inside Israel to be permanent second-class citizens. That are the stated goals of the most powerful people pushing this law. If we can understand what the BDS movement means by looking at quotations and statements by BDS leaders, we can understand what this law means by looking at what Ayel Shaked and other leaders of this movement who want this law have said they want. Right? So let's not be naive, and let's not talk about how Palestinians are affected by things without talking to Palestinians. Right? We would not, I think, want to talk about how African Americans are affected by things in the United States without talking to African Americans. So we, as a Jewish community, and I think this panel is a good first step in this example, in this trend, have got to stop talking about Palestinians without having Palestinians there to talk about their own experience.
So I just want to, by the way, I really love the passion and the thoughtfulness that you all exemplified tonight. I appreciate on behalf of everybody who's here and the why that you showed up despite the cold. And the fact is, this is part one, right? We just about finished part one. Now we can move on to the second chapter of this conversation. Hopefully some of you, if not all of you, will be back. There's so much more we have to talk to, because I think we just have put the trial in the field and turned over just a little bit, and there's so much more. So I thank all of you. Again, thank you for coming. I thank Jamil and Village Temple for being here, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you.